Margaret stepped off the dusty stagecoach in the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge, her hands trembling as she clutched her worn leather satchel. The journey from Boston had taken 3 weeks, and every mile had filled her with more doubt about her decision to become a mail-order bride. She had exchanged only a handful of letters with Thomas Whitman, a rancher who promised her a comfortable life and respectability. At 24, Margaret had few options left in a world that considered her an old maid. The town was smaller than she had imagined, with wooden buildings lining a single main street and dust swirling in the afternoon wind. She looked around nervously for Thomas, recognizing him from the photograph he had sent. He was a tall man with kind eyes and weathered hands, approaching her with a hesitant smile. Their greeting was awkward and formal, both understanding that they were strangers about to embark on the most intimate of partnerships. Thomas helped her into his wagon, making polite conversation about the weather and the town as they rode to his ranch. The landscape stretched endlessly before them, rolling hills covered in prairie grass that whispered secrets in the wind. Margaret noticed how his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, a habit that seemed born from years of watching for trouble. When she asked about it, Thomas mentioned that tensions with the local Sioux tribe had been running high lately, though he tried to reassure her that his ranch was well protected. As they approached the modest wooden house that would become her new home, Margaret felt a mixture of hope and fear. The building was sturdy and well-maintained, with a small garden and a barn nearby. Thomas had clearly put effort into preparing for her arrival, and she could see fresh curtains in the windows and wildflowers planted along the path to the front door. He carried her trunk inside, showing her the simple but clean rooms that would be her domain. That evening, as they sat down to a dinner Thomas had prepared himself, the conversation remained stilted and careful. Both were trying to gauge the other, wondering if this arrangement could possibly work. Margaret noticed how Thomas kept glancing toward the windows, and she began to understand that his constant vigilance was more than just habit. When she asked about the nearby Sioux settlement, his expression grew serious, and he explained that while most interactions were peaceful, recent incidents had everyone on edge. As darkness fell, Thomas showed Margaret to her room, explaining that he had prepared a separate space for her until they both felt more comfortable with their arrangement. She appreciated his consideration, though the isolation of the ranch and the strangeness of her situation left her feeling vulnerable and alone. The sounds of the prairie night were unfamiliar and sometimes frightening, filled with animal calls and the constant whisper of wind through the grass. Margaret lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. The moonlight streaming through her window cast strange shadows on the walls, and every creak of the house settling made her heart race. She had burned her bridges in Boston, selling everything she owned to pay for the journey west. There was no going back now, and the weight of that realization pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. Just as she was beginning to drift off to sleep, a soft tapping at her window made her bolt upright. The sound was too deliberate to be a tree branch or the wind, and her heart began to pound as she crept toward the glass. Peering through the curtain, she saw nothing but darkness and shadows, but the tapping continued, insistent and rhythmic. Fear paralyzed her for a moment, but curiosity eventually won out, and she carefully lifted the window sash. A young Sioux girl, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, crouched beneath the window. Her dark eyes were wide with urgency, and she gestured frantically for Margaret to come closer. The girl spoke in broken English mixed with her native tongue, but her meaning was clear enough. She was trying to warn Margaret about something, pointing toward the main house and making slashing motions across her throat. Margaret's blood turned cold as she realized the girl was trying to tell her that she was in danger. The girl reached up and grabbed Margaret's wrist with surprising strength, her grip desperate and pleading. In the moonlight, Margaret could see tears streaming down the young woman's face, and the terror in her expression was unmistakable. Whatever threat she was warning about was real and immediate, and Margaret suddenly understood that her first night as a mail-order bride was about to take a turn she could never have imagined. Margaret's hands shook as she helped pull the Sioux girl through her bedroom window. The young woman was trembling, her traditional dress torn and dirty as if she had traveled far and fast to reach the ranch. She kept looking over her shoulder toward the darkness beyond, her fear so intense that Margaret could feel it like a physical presence in the small room. The girl whispered urgently in her native language, occasionally switching to broken English words that sent chills down Margaret's spine. "Bad men come, the girl managed to say, her voice barely audible. "Tonight, they hurt you. Hurt him." She pointed toward the main part of the house where Thomas slept, then grabbed Margaret's shoulders with both hands. Her dark eyes bore into Margaret's with desperate intensity as she struggled to communicate something vital. Margaret realized this young woman had risked everything to warn complete strangers about approaching danger, and the weight of that sacrifice was not lost on her. The girl introduced herself as Little Star, daughter of a respected medicine woman from the nearby Sioux camp. She explained in her halting English that she had been gathering herbs near the river when she overheard 3 white men planning to attack the Whitman ranch. They had been drinking and talking loudly about the new woman who had arrived, making crude comments about what they intended to do. Little Star had recognized their voices as belonging to the Driscoll brothers, known troublemakers who had been causing problems for both white settlers and Native Americans in the area. Margaret felt sick as Little Star described what she had overheard. The Driscoll brothers believed that Thomas would be unprepared to defend both himself and a new wife, making them easy targets for robbery and worse. They planned to strike before dawn, when people were deepest in sleep and least likely to mount an effective defense. Little Star had run through the night to reach the ranch in time, driven by a sense of honor that would not allow innocent people to be harmed if she could prevent it. "We must wake him," Margaret whispered, gesturing toward Thomas's room. But Little Star grabbed her arm and shook her head vigorously. She pointed toward the front of the house and held up 3 fingers, then made creeping motions with her hands. The men were already here, positioned around the house and waiting for the right moment to strike. Any noise or sudden light might trigger them to attack immediately, before Margaret and Thomas could prepare any defense. Little Star pulled a small knife from her belt and pressed it into Margaret's trembling hands. The blade was sharp and well-maintained, clearly a tool that had seen regular use. The girl then showed Margaret how to hold it properly, demonstrating with quick, efficient movements that spoke of hard-won survival skills. Margaret had never held a weapon in her life, but the cold metal in her palm felt reassuring and terrifying at the same time. Moving with practiced silence, Little Star led Margaret to the window and pointed toward strategic positions around the ranch buildings. Margaret could barely make out the dark shapes of men crouched behind the barn, near the well and beside the front porch. The realization that armed intruders had surrounded her new home while she lay sleeping sent waves of terror through her body. She understood now why Little Star had been so frightened, and why the girl had taken such risks to warn them. Little Star whispered a plan that was both simple and dangerous. She would create a distraction near the barn, drawing the men's attention away from the house long enough for Margaret to wake Thomas and arm themselves. It was risky, but their options were limited with armed men already in position around the property. Little Star made it clear that time was running out, and they needed to act before the attackers decided to move forward with their original plan. Margaret wanted to protest, to find a safer way that would not put the brave young woman in additional danger, but Little Star was already moving toward the window, her expression determined and resolute. She turned back once to look at Margaret, and in that moment something passed between them that transcended language and cultural differences. It was a recognition of shared courage and mutual respect, a bond formed in the crucible of danger. As Little Star disappeared into the darkness outside, Margaret crept toward Thomas's room, the knife clutched in her sweating palm. Every step seemed to echo loudly in the quiet house, and she was certain that the intruders would hear her heartbeat from their positions around the ranch. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet and she froze each time, waiting for shouts or gunfire that would signal their plan had been discovered. She reached Thomas's door and hesitated, knowing that once she woke him, there would be no turning back from whatever violence was about to unfold. Margaret had come west seeking a new life and peaceful domesticity, but instead she found herself thrust into a situation that would test every ounce of courage she possessed. With Little Star risking her life outside and armed men waiting to strike, Margaret realized her first night as a mail-order bride would be nothing like the quiet, awkward evening she had anticipated. Margaret gently shook Thomas awake, placing her hand firmly over his mouth to prevent any startled exclamation. His eyes snapped open immediately and she could see the instant alertness of a man accustomed to frontier dangers. When she whispered about the men outside and Little Star's warning, Thomas was on his feet within seconds, reaching for the rifle that hung above his bed. His movements were quick and practiced, suggesting this was not his first encounter with night raiders. Thomas listened intently as Margaret repeated Little Star's information about the Driscoll brothers and their positions around the ranch. His jaw tightened when she mentioned their crude plans, and she could see controlled anger building behind his calm exterior. He moved to the window and carefully peered through a gap in the curtains, confirming the presence of armed figures near the barn and well. The situation was exactly as Little Star had described, and Thomas knew the Driscolls' reputation for violence and cruelty. "They've been wanting an excuse to cause trouble," Thomas whispered, checking his ammunition. "My ranch sits on good water rights, and they've been pressuring me to sell for months. They probably figured a new wife would make me vulnerable, give them leverage to force me out." He handed Margaret a smaller pistol from a wooden box, showing her quickly how to load and fire it. His hands were steady and confident, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders as he prepared for what was coming. A sudden crash from outside made them both freeze. Little Star's distraction had begun, and they could hear angry shouts from the direction of the barn. Thomas grabbed additional ammunition and motioned for Margaret to follow him toward the kitchen, where they would have better visibility and multiple escape routes if needed. The sounds outside grew louder as the Driscoll brothers tried to figure out what was happening near their position. Through the kitchen window, they could see Little Star darting between the ranch buildings, her small form barely visible in the moonlight. She moved with incredible speed and agility, leading the confused men away from the house and toward the open pasture. Margaret watched in amazement as the young Sioux woman used every shadow and obstacle to her advantage, staying just visible, enough to draw their pursuit while remaining beyond their reach. Thomas positioned himself at the front window while directing Margaret to watch the back of the house in case any of the intruders tried to circle around. The weight of the pistol in her hands felt foreign and dangerous, but she was determined not to let fear paralyze her. When so much depended on their ability to defend themselves, she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. The first gunshot shattered the night silence, followed immediately by several more. Thomas cursed under his breath as muzzle flashes lit up the area near the barn, and Margaret realized that Little Star was now in terrible danger. The brave girl who had risked everything to warn them was being hunted by armed men who would show no mercy if they caught her. Margaret felt a surge of protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. "There by the well," Thomas whispered urgently, pointing to a figure creeping toward the house. One of the Driscoll brothers had broken away from chasing Little Star and was attempting to reach the front door. Thomas took careful aim through the window, his breathing controlled and steady. When he fired, the intruder dropped behind the stone well, wounded but still dangerous. The man's pained curses echoed across the ranch yard. Margaret saw movement near the back door and called out a warning to Thomas just as the kitchen window exploded inward. Glass showered the room as another Driscoll brother attempted to climb through the opening, his face twisted with rage and alcohol-fueled confidence. Margaret raised her pistol with shaking hands, knowing she had only seconds to act before the man gained entry to the house. The confrontation she had never imagined possible was upon her, and everything depended on her ability to overcome a lifetime of gentle upbringing and find the courage to fight. The man in the window saw her weapon and snarled something obscene, but Margaret could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes as he realized the helpless mail-order bride was armed and prepared to defend herself. Thomas was engaged, with another attacker at the front of the house, his rifle fire keeping them pinned behind cover but unable to fully eliminate the threat. Margaret was on her own against the intruder at the kitchen window, and she knew that hesitation could cost them everything. Little Star was still out there somewhere in the darkness, having sacrificed her safety to give them this chance to survive. With her finger on the trigger and her heart pounding like thunder, Margaret faced her first real test of courage. The comfortable life she had imagined as a rancher's wife had vanished in a single night, replaced by deadly violence and the stark realities of frontier survival. She thought of Little Star's brave example and found strength she never knew she possessed, preparing to fight for her new life and the man who had offered her shelter. Margaret pulled the trigger just as the intruder began climbing through the shattered window. The pistol's recoil knocked her backward, and the deafening bang left her ears ringing. But she saw the man jerk and fall back outside with a howl of pain. She had only wounded him, but it was enough to send him scrambling for cover behind the water barrel. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the weapon, but she felt a fierce pride at having defended her new home. The wounded Driscoll brother was cursing and threatening terrible revenge, his voice slurred with pain and whiskey. Margaret could hear him reloading his gun and knew he would try again soon. She pressed herself against the kitchen wall, trying to stay out of sight while keeping her pistol trained on the broken window. Every shadow outside seemed to move with menace, and she jumped at every sound, expecting another attack at any moment. Thomas called out from the front room that he had wounded one attacker but couldn't locate the third brother. The situation was becoming more desperate as the remaining Driscolls regrouped and planned their next assault. Margaret realized that their ammunition was limited, and the intruders seemed willing to keep fighting despite their wounds. Time was working against them, and they needed to find a way to end the confrontation before reinforcements arrived, or their luck ran out. A new sound from outside caught Margaret's attention, and she peered carefully through the damaged window. Little Star had reappeared near the barn, but now she was not alone. 3 Sioux warriors had joined her, moving silently through the ranch yard with weapons drawn. Margaret's heart leaped with hope as she understood that the brave young woman had somehow summoned help from her people. The cavalry that was arriving wore buckskin and feathers instead of blue uniforms. The remaining Driscoll brothers must have spotted the newcomers at the same time, because their confident shouts turned to panicked cursing. Margaret could hear them arguing about whether to fight or flee, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of skilled warriors who knew the darkness better than they did. The balance of power had shifted dramatically in just a few moments, and the hunters were becoming the hunted. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face grim but determined. He had seen the Sioux warriors too, and was trying to decide whether they represented salvation or additional danger. Margaret quickly explained Little Star's warning and assistance, and she saw relief flood his expression as he understood that these were allies, not enemies. The young Sioux woman had not only warned them of danger, but had also brought help when they needed it most. A series of war cries echoed across the ranch yard, followed by the sounds of running feet and desperate shouts. The Driscoll brothers were in full retreat now, abandoning their wounded companion behind the well and fleeing toward their horses. The Sioux warriors pursued them with deadly efficiency, their intimate knowledge of the terrain giving them every advantage in the darkness. Margaret watched through the window as justice played out in the moonlight. The warrior who had been left behind the well was calling out for mercy, his earlier arrogance replaced by whimpering fear. Thomas emerged from the house with his rifle, approaching the wounded man cautiously while Margaret provided cover from the kitchen window. The confrontation that had seemed so dangerous just minutes earlier was ending with surprising swiftness. Thanks to Little Star's courage and her people's intervention, one of the Sioux warriors returned to report that the fleeing Driscolls had been captured alive, though not without resistance. The warrior spoke briefly with Little Star in their native language, and Margaret saw the young woman nod with satisfaction. Justice would be served according to tribal law, which was often more certain and swift than anything the distant territorial courts could provide. The threat to the ranch had been neutralized completely. Little Star approached the house, her face showing exhaustion, but also pride in what they had accomplished together. She had proven that cooperation between white settlers and Native Americans was not only possible, but could be essential for survival on the frontier. Margaret felt overwhelming gratitude toward the brave young woman, who had risked everything to warn strangers about danger, then brought help when it was needed most. Thomas lowered his rifle and invited Little Star and the warriors to approach the house. The formal tensions that usually existed between the two communities seemed to evaporate in the aftermath of their shared victory. Margaret realized she was witnessing something rare and precious, a moment of genuine understanding and mutual respect that transcended cultural boundaries and historical grievances. As dawn began to break over the prairie, Margaret surveyed the damage to her new home and marveled at how much had changed in a single night. She had arrived as a nervous mail-order bride seeking security and respectability, but the violence and danger had forged her into something stronger. The quiet, domestic life she had imagined was gone forever, replaced by something more challenging but also more meaningful. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the ranch yard, Margaret began preparing coffee and breakfast for their unexpected guests. Little Star and the 3 Sioux warriors had accepted Thomas's invitation to rest and eat before returning to their camp, and Margaret was determined to show proper hospitality to the people who had saved their lives. The kitchen still bore signs of the night's violence, with broken glass scattered across the floor and bullet holes in the walls, but it was functional enough to serve their purposes. Little Star sat quietly at the kitchen table, her exhaustion finally showing now that the danger had passed. Margaret noticed how young she looked in the morning light, barely more than a girl despite her incredible courage and resourcefulness. As Margaret served her coffee, Little Star began to speak more freely, her English improving as she relaxed. What she revealed about her motivations for helping them would change everything Margaret thought she understood about her situation. "Your husband," Little Star began hesitantly. "He is good man. He helped my people before when soldiers come." She explained that Thomas had provided supplies and medical assistance to the Sioux camp during a particularly harsh winter, asking for nothing in return except peaceful coexistence. When army patrols had threatened to attack the camp over stolen cattle they had not actually taken, Thomas had testified on their behalf, risking his own standing in the white community. Margaret looked at Thomas with new eyes as Little Star continued her story. The man she had agreed to marry based on a few formal letters was far more complex and honorable than she had realized. He had been quietly building bridges between two communities that were often at war, using his position and resources to help people who had few other allies. His constant vigilance, which she had attributed to general frontier wariness, was actually born from his knowledge of the delicate balance he was trying to maintain. Thomas seemed embarrassed by Little Star's praise, insisting that he had only done what any decent person would do when faced with suffering neighbors. But Margaret could see that his actions had required considerable courage and sacrifice, especially given the attitudes of many white settlers toward Native Americans. He had risked his business relationships, his social standing, and even his personal safety to help people who were often viewed as enemies by his own community. Little Star revealed another shocking truth about the previous night's attack. The Driscoll brothers had not simply been opportunistic criminals looking to rob a vulnerable rancher. They had been hired by a group of local businessmen who wanted to drive Thomas off his land because of his sympathetic treatment of the Sioux. His water rights were valuable, but his reputation as an Indian lover made him a target for those who wanted to escalate tensions between the communities for their own profit. The realization that Thomas's kindness had made him enemies in his own community filled Margaret with both pride and concern. She understood now why he had been so cautious in his letters, revealing little about his personal beliefs or activities. A mail-order bride might easily have been frightened away by the knowledge that her intended husband was involved in controversial politics and surrounded by people who wished him harm. Margaret found herself studying Thomas's face as he spoke with the Sioux warriors, noting the easy respect that flowed both ways in their conversation. These were not the interactions of strangers or reluctant allies, but of people who had built genuine friendships despite the cultural barriers between them. She realized that marrying Thomas would mean joining not just his household, but his cause of promoting peace and understanding between hostile communities. One of the warriors, an older man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, spoke at length with Little Star in their native language. Margaret could tell from their expressions that they were discussing something important, and she felt a growing sense that decisions were being made that would affect her future. When Little Star turned back to address her and Thomas, her expression was serious and formal. "My father, he is chief of our band," Little Star explained. "He say you both welcome in our camp always. You are family now because you fight together, because you trust when trust was hard." The formal adoption into the tribal community was an extraordinary honor, one that carried both privileges and responsibilities. Margaret realized that her identity was being transformed in ways she could never have anticipated when she stepped off the stagecoach just yesterday. Thomas explained to Margaret that this offer of kinship was unprecedented for white settlers in the region. It would provide them with powerful allies and protection, but it would also make their position among some white settlers even more precarious. The choice of whether to accept this honor was hers to make as well as his, since it would affect their marriage and their future together in fundamental ways. Margaret looked around the damaged kitchen, thinking about the violence they had survived and the courage of the young woman who had saved them. She thought about Thomas's quiet heroism and the respect he had earned from people who had every reason to distrust white settlers. Most importantly, she thought about the person she had discovered herself to be in the crucible of danger, someone capable of fighting for what was right even when it was terrifying. When she spoke, her voice was steady and certain. The frightened mail-order bride who had arrived the day before was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that some things were worth fighting for, no matter how dangerous or difficult they might prove to be. "I accept the honor of being considered family," Margaret said firmly, addressing both Little Star and the Sioux warriors. "And I accept the responsibilities that come with it." Her words seemed to surprise Thomas, who had perhaps expected his mail-order bride to be frightened away by the complexities and dangers of his situation. Instead, Margaret felt a deep sense of rightness about joining a cause that valued justice and human dignity above social conventions and material comfort. Little Star smiled for the first time since entering Margaret's window, and the expression transformed her tired young face completely. She reached across the table and took Margaret's hand, speaking rapidly in Sioux before switching back to English. "You have warrior heart," she said simply. "My grandmother, she see such things in dreams. She say new woman come who help bridge the two worlds. Maybe you are that woman." The weight of expectation in Little Star's words might have been overwhelming under different circumstances, but Margaret found herself accepting the possibility that she had been brought to this place for reasons beyond her own simple desire for security and marriage. The attack the night before had shown her capabilities she never knew she possessed, and the morning's revelations had opened her eyes to a larger purpose that her life could serve. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out over his ranch with new eyes. The property represented more than just his livelihood now. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose cooperation over conflict. But he also understood that their decision to openly ally themselves with the Sioux would make them targets for every person in the territory who profited from hatred and division. The comfortable anonymity of their marriage arrangement was gone forever. "There will be consequences," Thomas said quietly, turning back to face Margaret and their guests. "Some of the townspeople already view me with suspicion. Others will see our alliance as betrayal of our own kind. We may find ourselves isolated from the white community, dependent entirely on the friendships we build with your people." He was giving Margaret a final chance to reconsider, to choose the safer path of conventional respectability. Margaret thought about her old life in Boston, the narrow social circles and rigid expectations that had made her feel like a stranger in her own community. She had come west seeking something different, though she had not been able to articulate exactly what that might be. Now she understood that she had been searching for a place where her actions could matter, where her choices could make a real difference in the world around her. "I didn't come here to hide from challenges," Margaret replied. "I came here to build a new life, and I want that life to mean something. If we can help prevent more violence, if we can prove that different peoples can live together in peace, then whatever hardships we face will be worthwhile." She surprised herself with the conviction in her voice, but the words felt completely true as she spoke them. Little Star began preparing to leave, gathering her torn dress around her and checking the small knife she had lent to Margaret the night before. The older warrior spoke quietly with Thomas about practical matters, discussing ways to maintain communication between the ranch and the Sioux camp, warning systems in case of future attacks, and protocols for trade and mutual assistance. Margaret realized she was witnessing the formation of a formal alliance that could serve as a model for other communities. Before departing, Little Star pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation. The young woman's expression was serious as she explained that the path they were choosing would require both courage and wisdom. There would be people in both communities who opposed any cooperation between white settlers and Native Americans, and some would use violence to prevent such alliances from succeeding. Margaret would need to be constantly alert and ready to defend not just her home but her principles. "But you have good medicine," Little Star continued, using a phrase that Margaret understood to mean spiritual strength or positive energy. "You choose right when choosing was hard. You fight when fighting was needed. You accept friendship when friendship was offered. These are signs of a person who can walk between worlds without losing herself." The young woman's confidence in her assessment was both encouraging and daunting. As the Sioux party prepared to leave, Margaret realized that her transformation from mail-order bride to frontier ally had been completed in less than 24 hours. The woman who had arrived on yesterday's stagecoach would barely recognize the person she had become, and there was no going back to her former innocence or naivety. She had chosen a path that would define the rest of her life, and she felt both exhilarated and terrified by the magnitude of that choice. Thomas walked their guests to their horses, engaging in final discussions about future meetings and mutual support. Margaret watched from the damaged kitchen window, seeing her husband in a completely new light. The formal, awkward man who had met her at the stagecoach was gone, replaced by someone she could truly respect and eventually love. Their marriage might have begun as a practical arrangement, but it was becoming something much deeper and more meaningful. When the Sioux party disappeared over the horizon, Thomas returned to the house to find Margaret already beginning repairs to the damaged kitchen. She had swept up the broken glass and was examining the bullet holes in the walls, planning how to patch them effectively. Her practical response to the destruction impressed him, and he began to understand that he had gained not just a wife, but a true partner in every sense of the word. 3 weeks after the attack, Margaret stood in her repaired kitchen preparing a feast for an unprecedented gathering. Representatives from both the white settlement and the Sioux camp were coming to the ranch for a formal peace meeting, with Thomas and Margaret serving as neutral hosts for the historic occasion. The bullet holes in the walls had been carefully patched and painted over, but Margaret had chosen to leave one visible as a reminder of how quickly violence could erupt when fear and prejudice ruled over reason and compassion. The relationship between Margaret and Thomas had deepened considerably during those weeks of recovery and preparation. Working together to rebuild their damaged home and plan for the peace gathering had created an intimacy that their original mail-order arrangement could never have achieved. They had moved beyond the careful politeness of strangers to the comfortable partnership of people who shared common goals and mutual respect. Margaret had surprised both herself and Thomas with her natural talent for diplomacy and organization. Her Boston education, which had seemed almost useless on the frontier, proved invaluable when dealing with the complex cultural and political issues surrounding the peace negotiations. She could navigate the social expectations of the white community, while also understanding and respecting the traditions and concerns of the Sioux, making her an ideal mediator between the two groups. Little Star had become a frequent visitor to the ranch, serving as Margaret's guide to Sioux customs and language while also learning about white settler culture from someone she trusted completely. The friendship between the two women had grown strong and deep, transcending the cultural barriers that kept most members of their communities apart. Margaret found in Little Star a sister she had never had, while the young Sioux woman discovered that not all white people were driven by greed and hatred. The peace meeting itself had required weeks of careful preparation and delicate negotiation. Both communities included people who were skeptical of any cooperation with their traditional enemies, and it had taken considerable effort to convince them that dialogue was worth attempting. Thomas and Margaret had used their position as neutral parties to facilitate these discussions, gradually building trust and understanding between groups that had been suspicious of each other for generations. On the morning of the gathering, Margaret felt both nervous and hopeful as she made final preparations for the day ahead. The success or failure of this meeting could determine whether the territory descended into renewed violence or found a path toward lasting peace. She understood that the choices made in the next few hours would affect not only her own future but the lives of countless families in both communities. The first arrivals were 3 white ranchers from the surrounding area, men who had known Thomas for years, but were still uncertain about his recent alliance with the Sioux. Margaret greeted them with careful courtesy, serving coffee and making conversation designed to put them at ease while subtly reinforcing the message that cooperation served everyone's interests better than conflict. Her natural grace and intelligence quickly won their respect, even from those who had initially been skeptical of Thomas's foreign bride. Little Star arrived with her father, the chief, and 2 other tribal elders, all dressed in their finest ceremonial clothing for the important occasion. Margaret had learned enough Sioux protocol to greet them appropriately, and her obvious respect for their customs made a powerful impression on the Native American delegation. The fact that a white woman had taken the time to learn their language and traditions spoke volumes about her sincerity and commitment to genuine friendship. As the 2 groups gathered around Margaret's dining table, the initial tension was palpable. Years of mistrust and occasional violence had created deep divisions that could not be easily overcome, even by people of goodwill. But Margaret had planned carefully for this moment, serving foods that were familiar to both cultures and arranging the seating to encourage conversation rather than confrontation. Thomas began the meeting by recounting the events of 3 weeks earlier, emphasizing how Little Star's warning had saved both his and Margaret's lives. The story served as a powerful reminder that cooperation between the communities could literally mean the difference between life and death. Several of the white ranchers nodded thoughtfully as they realized how the Sioux woman's courage had protected people they knew and respected. The chief spoke next, with Little Star translating his words about the importance of finding peaceful solutions to the conflicts that had plagued both peoples. He emphasized that his band wanted only to live safely on their traditional lands, while maintaining respectful relationships with their white neighbors. The sincerity in his voice and the dignity of his bearing made it impossible for even the most skeptical attendees to dismiss him as a savage or threat. Margaret found herself serving as an informal translator, not just of languages but of cultural concepts and concerns. When the white ranchers expressed fears about cattle theft, she helped them understand the Sioux perspective on property and land use. When the Native Americans worried about encroachment on sacred sites, she explained their spiritual beliefs in terms that the settlers could appreciate and respect. The breakthrough came when one of the older ranchers, a man named Samuel Hayes who had lost cattle to rustlers the previous year, admitted that his missing livestock had been recovered from white thieves, not Sioux raiders. His honesty opened the door for other admissions, that many of the crimes blamed on Native Americans had actually been committed by white criminals, seeking to escalate tensions for their own benefit. Little Star then revealed additional information about the Driscoll brothers and their employers, naming specific white businessmen who had been paying them to steal cattle and blame the thefts on the Sioux. The conspiracy was larger and more organized than anyone had realized, with certain powerful individuals actively working to prevent peace in order to justify seizing more Native American land through military action. The revelation transformed the entire dynamic of the meeting. Instead of two communities suspicious of each other, they suddenly found themselves facing a common enemy that had been manipulating both groups for personal gain. The real threat to peace and prosperity came not from cultural differences, but from greed and corruption that transcended racial boundaries. By the end of the day, a formal agreement had been reached establishing protocols for communication, trade, and mutual defense between the white settlers and the Sioux band. Margaret and Thomas's ranch would serve as a neutral meeting ground where disputes could be resolved peacefully, and both communities committed to sharing information about criminal activities that affected their mutual interests. As the sun set over the prairie, Margaret stood beside Thomas watching their guests depart with handshakes and promises to meet again soon. The transformation in relationships had been remarkable, with former enemies now discussing plans for cooperative ventures and shared celebrations. The peace that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier was beginning to take root in practical agreements and personal friendships. Little Star was the last to leave, embracing Margaret warmly and whispering words of gratitude in both English and Sioux. The young woman who had risked everything to warn strangers about danger had become the catalyst for a transformation that would benefit generations yet to come. Her courage had not only saved lives but had opened a path toward a future where different peoples could live together in harmony and mutual respect. That night, as Margaret and Thomas sat on their front porch looking out over their peaceful ranch, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west as a frightened mail-order bride seeking only security and respectability, but had found instead a purpose and partnership that gave meaning to every day of her life. The woman she had become was stronger, wiser, and more fulfilled than she could ever have imagined possible. The mail-order bride arrangement that had seemed so practical and businesslike had blossomed into a true love story, but one written on a canvas much larger than a single couple's happiness. Margaret and Thomas had discovered that their greatest joy came not from their own contentment, but from their ability to serve something greater than themselves, building bridges between worlds and proving that understanding could triumph over fear when people of courage chose to make it so.